The arguments about Constellation have been circulating Genshin for an extremely long time, and people are really like in the middle whether Constellations are good to pull for or not good to pull for. But I will explain all my opinions in this video, and hopefully I will help you decide your opinion on this whole subject. I'm going to be going over which Constellations I think are worth it, and in general the criteria for pulling Constellations in general. It's going to be a nice video, so stick around until the end. And I'm going to be discussing a very special character constellation, one that is coming out next banner. So stick around, lad. There has always been a massive debate whether constellations are actually worth getting or not in Genshin, and it's always because, you know, the big amount of money and the fact that you're paying the same amount as you would for a whole new character for an added bonus onto your current character. So obviously, as arisen many controversies in between the start of Genshin and now, but I have compiled you my reasonings on why it's good and why it's bad, and just like a final conclusion, and going over some ones that I think are probably the best for you to get. So obviously stick around until the end. When considering what constellations are actually worth it, you can't just consider if the ability that it is giving is actually good for its price. For example, I might agree to like a decent C1 rather than an amazing C6, because realistically the 99th percentile of Genshin people aren't going to be going for that C6, and for obvious reasons, because it's not worth it most of the time. But there are times that I think it is acceptable to get that far in constellations, and you might call me crazy, but just let me explain my reasonings later on, and then have your justifications in the comments below. Obviously there are constellations which are better than others. That's why I made this whole video, because some people C1s are really bad compared to like another character C1, which increases the damage tremendously. For example, let's talk about Hu Tao and Ayaka. Both really incredibly strong characters, and characters that you probably want to pull for. So they're a great baseline. Now Hu Tao's C1 is like one of the best ones in the whole game in terms of Hu Tao herself, because without her C1 she does kind of feel kind of clunky and kind of unfinished in a way. And that obviously makes sense because, you know, you're managing stamina and you're constantly charge attacking with her as a whole kit. So obviously there's going to be a bit of mix-ups, and obviously the C1 completely eliminates the stamina while she's in her E stance, which is fucking huge for her and her damage and just her comfortability, because then you can like dash cancel and all this other stuff. But this isn't really a Hu Tao oriented video, so we're just going to leave that for a different video. Now talking about Ayaka, Ayaka's first constellation is one that you probably will not want to be pulling for. Now by almost any tool or website or anything, Ayaka's C1 is considered really low importance, considering the fact it only really helps the cooldown of her E, which most of the time you really won't be needing to cooldown, as it's not really like a big part of her kit. It does like a lot of damage, but it's not something that you should be paying the price for a whole new character for. Definitely by far you shouldn't. Now keeping on with Hu Tao and Ayaka, when it comes to their second constellations, the roles are kind of flipped behind, where Hu Tao's C2, the only thing it affects is like the effect you put on enemies after you use your elemental skill and hit them, which is like pyro damage over time, which that pyro damage is still really pretty weak. So it's nothing worth it in the slightest. You really shouldn't be going for that. Now very much on the other hand, Ayaka's C2 is busted by many means. Her C2 basically adds 2 other versions of her burst simultaneously, which are smaller versions, and each deal 20% of the original damage, which means now you have 40% more damage going on at the same time, which obviously is huge for especially Ayaka when her burst just does so much so fast. Now I am going to skip to both of their C6s instead of going over each constellation, because they both have powerful constellations, but this is just like a small comparison to start off the video. When people initially look at Hu Tao's 6th constellation, they think that they can just stack crit damage on her and she will basically be an impenetrable character and become like one of the best characters in the whole game, because, you know, you get 100% crit rate. That alone will like trigger like neurons in the player's brains, like, oh my god, like this has to be an amazing constellations, until you realize the fact that it only occurs when she gets hit really hard and only once every 60 seconds. So it's like the only time where you're actually going to utilize that is very rare. Like sure, in Spiral Abyss it will probably work quite well, but at the end of the day, doing that much for Constellation 6 that you will only be using 10% of the time isn't really a worthwhile investment. Now Ayaka, if you're running her as a main DPS, her 6th constellation might be a bit appealing to her. Ayaka's C6 gives her a massive actually a massive increase to her charge attack damage and like specific intervals, which if you're running her as a main DPS, it may be worthwhile to you. And obviously it does big damage, but it's hard to decide what Constellation 6 is worthwhile, considering that is a lot of money and a lot of opportunities missed to get other characters. So judging what is actually a good 6 Constellation it's not an easy task. But if you like her C6 won't do you damage, unlike Hu Tao's, because Hu Tao's, you kind of end up in a mix-up situation where half of you is like, yeah, I'm going to build a full crit damage, but then you realize you still kind of need some crit rate in the baseline before so you can actually use her outside of getting that effect, because that effect only triggers when you're like really low health. So it's kind of like a middle standpoint where a C6 doesn't really seem that efficient to get, because at the end of the day, it's not something you can use 100% of the time. Unlike Ayaka's, where whenever you're charged attacking, you can use it. But obviously, Constellations can look pretty and can have amazing effects on characters, purely because of the simple cost of time and money that it takes to reach the point of getting the character Constellation. Because obviously, in order to get character Constellation, you need to get a copy of that 5-star character, which means at maximum you're spending 180 wish per constellation, and for characters C1s you're spending a minimum of 360. So yeah, 360 wishes for a guaranteed is not very good, and that's for one constellation, and that's including the first character obviously. So you really got to think about who you want to get constellations for if you're planning on getting constellations. And my biggest piece of advice for constellations is, if you do not have the financial gains, or like if you don't have enough for it, if you cannot be stable and buy constellations at the same time, don't buy constellations. Because if you're like a medium spender and like you don't earn as much as like, you know, rich YouTubers and stuff like that, like that's why you see them all going for C6 R5, because they have the money for that. The average Genshin player won't have that kind of money, so they'll see all that and then they'll think, yeah, one constellation can't hurt. When if you think about the price ranges, it's kind of bad if you're spending your way there, because for 80 wishes it costs 100 quid, and that's with bonus. Without the bonus gone, you only got 40 quid left. You only get 40 wishes per 100 quid. So like every time you're doing a 10 point, you're basically sacrificing a Domino's pizza, mate. So you kind of have to get really lucky if you don't want to completely ruin your bank account. By all means, if you have the money and you will be fine, I'm not saying don't spend it. If there is really nothing else you want and the game brings you happiness and this is what you want to spend your money on, if you get and have everything you need, then of course I'm not going to tell you don't spend it because it's a waste of money. Because if you have the money and it's going to make you happy, then you should go right ahead and do it. But never, not once, even if you can't. If you don't have that kind of money and you're not stable, don't spend your money on constellations. Always you have to think about that Genshin Impact at the end of the day is a video game, and it will never be anything more than that. So if you're willing to spend this much on a video game, then you go right ahead. But if you don't have the financial stability for it, don't do it at all in the slightest. It is not worth it. My personal advice is only get constellations for a character that you really, really like and you know that you're going to be using a lot. Because I don't want anyone wasting their money. That's obvious. You don't want to be wasting your money. But I also believe by all means constellations aren't a necessity on any characters. You could argue that some characters are necessities to have, but I would never ever say that constellations are a necessity. They give massive bonuses, but trust me, I have 36 star Abyss with C0 5 stars. Now since she will be rerunning next banner, and there are kind of like a lot of talks about her constellations, we're going to be talking about Raiden Shogun's C2 to be specific. Now obviously to get Raiden's Constellation 2, you're going to need Raiden herself, another copy, and another copy. That is 3 characters that you're sacrificing for this C2, and you do have to think about whether the weapon will be better for you or the constellations itself, unless you can get both, which lucky you mate, you're rich. Let's go over her first constellation real quick, because you all know the C2 is boosted, but the first constellation will get her stacks even faster. Especially when electro characters use their elemental bursts, the stacks you gained are increased by 80%, which is so huge. But if it's by other elemental characters, then it's 20%, which is still a good increase. But I think the C1 really buffs Kujo Sara more than Raiden herself, because it just makes her more versatile and more usable with Raiden, which obviously you want. For a copy of a whole character, I don't know how I feel about that being good for a Constellation 1. Considering the fact that there really ain't that much issues with gaining resolve on Raiden. It's not like it's impossible to do. It's not like it's something difficult to do. You just have to have the right team with high energy. Now onto her Constellation 2. This is the one that everyone always talks about. It is her burst shredding 60% of enemy defense, which is huge. You can't deny that for a Constellation. For anything, that is a huge power boost. Every person who recommends Raiden as a DPS will tell you to get Constellation 2, which even though it isn't mandatory, it helps so much and so significantly. Like, even I'm planning on buying that, using my Christmas money, of course. But I do think her Constellation 2 is huge. There is no denying that. For a Constellation 2 result, obviously 3 copies, you can't really get that much better Constellation 2s. So I think if you're going to pull for someone's Constellations, I think Raiden is an amazing option. Because with almost every single one, she gains massive, like C2 and C3, massive damage bonus. And with Raiden, you don't need to get to late Constellations for her to have the best Constellations already. So it's like the C3 and then you've got the best Raiden in the game pretty much. So if you really enjoy Raiden, I would say go for the C2. But as always, as I'm saying, only if you have the money for it. Never otherwise. Only if you've got the money for it. Only if you have nothing else and you really like it. Because as a person, I think we should value our happiness more, and it seems like we don't really do it a lot in our generation anymore. So, you know, if it makes you happy and you think, you know, you're gonna have an amazing character after you pull it, I still would go for the Constellation that you want, but make sure first that it is a good Constellation, of course, and it's a character you're gonna use and you have the funds for it. As always, thanks for listening to me out. This was a really interesting video to make, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, yeah, follow my Twitch and everything, you know, get my numbers up.